Welcome back, you, to the deep dive.
Great to be back.
Today, we are plunging into some truly captivating territory. Really fascinating stuff. We're taking a deep dive into the connection between Eros, desire in all its complex, powerful forms, and magic, specifically how it was all understood back in the Renaissance.
Yeah, and the lens we're using, the source material you've given us, is excerpts from Ioan Couliano's book, Eros and Magic in the Renaissance, a really foundational text for this topic.
Exactly. And our mission for this deep dive is pretty specific. We're zooming right in on Chapter 4. That's pages 87 through 106.
Right.
We really want to unpack the ideas just in this section, understand how these historical concepts, desire, imagination, influence, even manipulation, were seen to kind of weave together back then.
Mm-hmm.
What did that tell them about their world? What did it mean for people actually living through that? And maybe, does any of it still echo today? Does it resonate now?
It's a great question, and we'll definitely be digging into some fundamental concepts here, like how Eros wasn't just, romance. It was seen as absolutely central to how magic actually worked.
Really? Central?
Yeah. And we'll look at the power they gave to phantasms,
Mm-hmm.
these mental images, the role of things like astrology within this whole picture, and some pretty dark connections, actually, between witchcraft accusations and societal repression, stuff that's quite surprising.
Okay, sounds like a real journey into a different way of thinking, but maybe one that feels, strangely familiar once you get into it.
Could be, yeah. It often does.
So we'll guide you through it. Aim for clarity, keep that sense of historical wonder, and hopefully you'll have a few aha moments with us. Let's open up these pages then. Chapter 4, Eros and Magic.
Right. So Couliano, drawing on these Renaissance thinkers, he doesn't mess around. He hits us straight away with a core assertion that might sound, pretty startling at first.
Okay, what is it?
He suggests Eros and magic aren't just, related fields. They're presented as fundamentally linked, maybe even having an identity of substance, identity of process.
Whoa, hold on. Identity of substance. That's huge. That's not just saying they're similar. It's saying they're kind of the same thing, made of the same stuff, operating the same way.
That's exactly the implication. It's a really strong claim, not just an analogy, but suggesting they are fundamentally the same process, just maybe viewed from different perspectives or applied in different contexts.
Okay. And how does he build up to that? Does it connect to other Renaissance ideas?
It does, yeah. The source points out this idea builds on themes Couliano likely discussed earlier in the book, things like, phantasms, which we just mentioned, and also those techniques of artificial memory.
Ah, right, the memory palaces and stuff, where you create vivid, sometimes really weird mental images, phantasms to remember things. So phantasms were already seen as having real power over the mind.
Precisely. They were tools for structuring the mind's internal landscape. And the principle connecting this to magic, the underlying logic, is that magic itself is understood, fundamentally, as a phantasmic process.
So magic isn't necessarily about, bending physical reality directly, like in fantasy movies?
Not primarily in this view. It works through these internal images, these phantasms, impressed upon the mind, or maybe projected outwards somehow.
So Renaissance magic, at its core, is about deliberately creating and manipulating specific mental images, phantasms, that actually do something, that exude some kind of real influence.
That's the mechanism they're proposing. And this process, Couliano explains, is thought to work because it taps into this continuity, this connection between the individual pneuma.
Pneuma, what's that exactly? Like breath or spirit?
Yeah, something like that. Think of it as a subtle spirit, a kind of vital force or vehicle within a person, almost like an energetic body.
Yep.
And this individual pneuma is seen as continuous with the universal pneuma.
Universal pneuma, like a cosmic spirit, something that connects everything.
Exactly. A world spirit permeating everything.
Right.
So there's this idea of a shared, subtle, energetic substance.
Yeah.
And phantasms are how your individual pneuma interacts with or influences this universal network.
Mm-hmm.
Imagination is the interface.
Okay, imagination as the bridge between your inner world and the cosmos itself.
Yeah.
That's a powerful idea.
It is. And the source does mention that the nitty-gritty details of this continuity mechanism, how it really works in magical practice, get explored more in later chapters, especially chapter 5.
Right.
But for this chapter, pages 87 to 106, the key takeaway is this fundamental link.
Oh.
Magic is a phantasmic process, working through the pneuma, linking the individual to the universal.
Got it. So if magic works through phantasms and pneuma, and Eros is fundamentally linked to magic, then desire itself, Eros, must also be seen as a kind of phantasmic pneumatic process. It's not just a feeling, it's an active force using these same subtle mechanisms.
You've got it. That's precisely where the logic leads. And this naturally brings us to the figure who uses this knowledge, the idea of the practitioner, the magician, or even the lover as a kind of great manipulator.
Ah, okay. The practical side. If this is how it works, how do you use it? The great manipulator sounds a bit ominous.
It can be. The text described the magician, or the lover, as a hunter of souls, animarum venator in Latin. They're not passive. They're actively seeking to capture, influence, bind something or someone.
A hunter of souls. Yeah, that's evocative and a bit chilling. What tools does this hunter use? Or are we talking actual traps?
Metaphorical ones, mostly. The sources talk about using nets, riti, and different kinds of bait. Words like ilex, ilesebra, esca, luring, trapping.
Okay, like setting a trap for someone's affection or their attention or maybe even their will.
Exactly. And the source draws a contrast based on the target.
Yeah.
The lover uses these techniques aiming for control over the pneumatic mechanism of the beloved.
The pneumatic mechanism again. So influencing their subtle spirit, their vital force, binding them on that level.
That's the idea. Desire isn't just passive attraction. It's seen as a form of targeted magic aimed at influencing someone fundamentally. It's quite an active, almost, aggressive view of love, isn't it?
It really is. And the magician, what are their targets?
Broader aims, usually. More ambitious, they might try to influence physical objects or other individuals beyond just love interests, maybe human society as a whole, or even powerful invisible beings, demons, heroes, that kind of thing, often for power or profit.
So applying the same basic techniques, phantasms, pneuma, but on a larger scale, trying to manipulate spirits or crowds.
Yes, and the key word for this process of influence is binding, vincier in Latin. And the general term for the processes, the tools of binding is chains.
Vincula.
Chains. Vincula.
And Couliano points out that this whole doctrine, the identity of love and magic operating through these vincula, it was hinted at by earlier guys like Ficino, but it's Giordano Bruno who really develops it systematically in his work De Vinculis.
De Vinculis, on bonds or on chains. Exactly. On bonds or on chains. Bruno's a key figure who lays out this entire system. He argues that love and magic are basically the same binding process.
Okay, so Bruno really systematizes it. And what does he say is the main pathway for creating these bonds, these vincula?
Well, following the logic we've seen, he identifies the primary pathway, the absolute crucial element, as fantasy, fantasia.
Back to phantasms. They just keep coming up. Seems like you can't understand any of this without understanding their role.
You really can't. Fantasy isn't just important. Bruno describes it as the main entrance, the porta et principus editus. For all magic, these the only gateway, sola porta, for our internal mental states. And maybe the most powerful description, he calls it the ultimate link, the chain of chains, vinculum vinculorum.
The chain of chains, the fundamental bond that makes all other bonds possible. Why? What's the reasoning? Why is fantasy so central?
It comes down to their understanding of how we know things. Epistemology. The source quotes this principle, rooted in Aristotle but given a specific Renaissance twist. There is nothing in the intellect that was not previously perceived by the senses.
Okay, standard enough. Senses are the input.
And there is nothing which, coming from the senses, can reach the intellect without the intermediary of fantasy.
Ah, okay, that's the key part. Fantasy isn't just making stuff up. It's the necessary processing step, the filter, the bridge between raw sense data and higher thought. Everything has to pass through fantasy.
Precisely. It's the indispensable intermediary. And our thinking mind, the cogitative faculty, isn't separate from this. In fact, by thinking about dwelling on processing these phantasms, the cogitative faculty actually increases their power. It magnifies the imaginary. And through this focus, it can actually subjugate the soul.
So thinking hard about an image makes it more potent, gives it power over you. That sounds, well, it sounds a lot like obsession or how propaganda works, maybe. Focusing attention to gain control.
The parallels are definitely there, aren't they? It's quite striking. And these vincules, these chains, they aren't one size fits all. The source stresses they're numerous, highly differentiated. You have to tailor them to the recipient.
Tailor them? How?
Based on their specific characteristics. Age, looks, physiognomy, individual personality traits. The text apparently say explicitly, two individuals never correspond to one another completely.
Right. Makes sense. What binds one person, what image or desire triggers them, won't necessarily work on someone else. We're all different.
Exactly. The source gives examples. Beauty, for instance.
Yeah.
Different people find different things beautiful, right? Or think about influencing a crowd versus influencing an elite group. Different tactics needed. Males versus females. Even preferences within genders, like for virgins versus experienced women. These reflect different internal setups needing different chains, different kinds of bait.
Okay, so the successful hunter of souls needs to be a pretty good psychologist, in a way. They need to understand their target's specific vulnerabilities, their desires, what phantasms will resonate with them to craft the right bait and nets.
That's the art of it, according to this system. It requires subtle understanding. But the constant, the thing that's always at the core, the source reiterates, is the quality of that ultimate chain, the vinculum vinculorum,
Which is?
Eros, or sensual pleasure, or sometimes fantasy itself, which the text notes amounts to the same thing in this context.
There it is again. Eros, pleasure, fantasy, the fundamental binding force, interchangeable almost.
Deeply intertwined, certainly. And Bruno, especially in De Vinculis, goes into fascinating detail about the different kinds of bonds. He has this phrase, multiplex semen, multiplex Venus, multiplex amor, multiplex vinculum.
Meaning multiple seeds, multiple Venuses.
Multiple kinds of love, multiple kinds of bonds. He talks about how this specific bond differs depending on the relationship. How you embrace your son is different from how you embrace your father or sister or wife or just a woman or a friend or even a libertine. These are all different types of connections, different vincula.
So it's not just romantic or sexual love. It's all forms of attachment, connection, influence.
All forms. And it's not even limited to people. Bruno apparently extends it to say that even things become attached to other things. It's a cosmic principle of connection and influence.
Wow. Okay. So binding isn't just psychological. It's how the universe itself holds together, in a way. Everything influencing everything else through these subtle bonds.
That's the picture they paint, yes. And the source throws in this really specific kind of esoteric detail from Bruno, too, about physical continence.
It's continence, like sexual restraint.
Yes, specifically conserving semen. Bruno suggested this could transform the physical substance into a kind of spiritual force. Yeah, a force capable of creating vincula, these magic bonds. He even thought it could make your speech more powerful, more persuasive.
That is quite something. Holding back physically translates into magical or persuasive power.
That was the idea. And it's interesting because it contrasts with his other advice on the psychic level, which was to actively produce voluptuous phantasms in your mind to influence consciousness.
So physical restraint for one kind of power, but intense mental indulgence in fantasy for another. That's a fascinating tension.
It really is. Shows the complexity. And these ideas, this whole framework of manipulation through fantasy and pneuma, it wasn't just about personal magic or love. It had wider implications.
Okay, where else do they apply this thinking? Politics, society.
Exactly. The source brings up a modern analogy Couliano himself uses, drawing on these historical ideas. The magician state versus the police state.
A magician state? What on earth is that?
Well, in this analogy, the magician state governs through subtlety, flexibility, adaptation. It's capable of metamorphosis, always developing new tactics, new ways to influence. Think persuasion, managing desires, shaping imagination, rather than just brute force.
Okay. Like using propaganda or public relations, maybe, but framed in this magical sense of manipulating phantasms.
Sort of, yeah. It's about influence rather than coercion. Now, the source notes it can degenerate. Maybe it gets too chaotic, too focused on internal changes. But Couliano apparently suggests it's still vastly preferable to the police state.
Vastly preferable, even if it functions badly sometimes. Why?
Because it holds long-term potential. It's dynamic. It works with the vitality of the populace, even if that vitality is sometimes excessive or misdirected.
Right.
It's fundamentally about change and adaptation.
Right. And the police state then? The opposite.
Exactly the opposite. It relies on coercion, force. It lacks subtlety, flexibility. It's all about defending old, outdated values becoming rigid like a prison. Couliano sees it as doomed because it defends slogans without vitality. It can't adapt to the underlying pneumatic and phantasmic shifts in society.
So one uses influence, adapts, maybe messy but has potential. The other uses force, is rigid, defends dead ideas, and is ultimately brittle. That's a really powerful political analogy built right out of Renaissance magic theory.
It is, isn't it?
Yeah.
Very thought-provoking. Then the source shifts gears slightly, looking at how magic itself was categorized. It references D.P. Walker's distinction between subjective and transitive magic.
Subjective and transitive, meaning?
Subjective magic is the stuff that works primarily on the magician themselves, getting your own house in order, so to speak. It's seen as preliminary, making your own pneuma more capable, more potent.
Okay, like purifying yourself, focusing your mind, generating the right internal phantasms first.
Exactly. And then transitive magic is what works outwardly. On the external world, other people, objects, spirits. The stuff that crosses the boundary from you to something else.
So you work on yourself first, subjective, to be able to effectively influence others, or the world, transitive.
Right. Though the source clarifies it's not always a neat division. Subjective magic is seen as a preliminary form of all magic. And it's kind of intersubjective anyway. What you do internally can loop back and affect you. But ultimately, the goal is always transitive. All magic aims to do something, to bind, to influence reality.
Even working on yourself is ultimately about becoming a better instrument for influencing the world or connecting with the cosmos or whatever the role is.
Precisely. And central to this internal work, the generation and processing of phantasms, is this concept of the pneumatic synthesizer.
The synthesizer sounds almost mechanical.
It does, yeah. This idea comes particularly from Synesius in his book On Dreams, which Ficino translated. Synesius thought this synthesizer was key not just for dreams, but also for prophecy and magic.
Okay, where did they think this synthesizer was? In the body?
They located it in the brain. They saw it as the primary body or vehicle of the soul, the place where visions and images actually form. Synesius called the brain the Acropolis, the citadel, the high fortress.
The brain as the fortress where phantasms are built. Okay. How did they think it worked?
Synesius described it as a double-faced mirror. One face reflects what is above, the eternal prototypes, the ideal forms, Platonic ideas, essentially. The other face reflects what is below, the raw data coming in from the senses.
So it integrates the ideal spiritual realm with the physical sensory world.
That's the idea. It's pneumatic in nature, made of this fantasticon pneuma, the fantastic spirit. It takes input from both realms and synthesizes the images, the phantasms that we experience. It's how the soul recognizes objects by comparing the sensory input, as a phantasm, to the ideal forms it already knows.
This fits perfectly with that earlier point about fantasy being the necessary bridge between senses and intellect. The synthesizer is the actual, well, the organ, the pneumatic organ, that does the synthesizing.
Exactly right. It's the mechanism behind the principle. The source then touches briefly on Ficino's astrological magic, noting he often focused more on, say, attracting a certain amount of planetary influence, quantitative, rather than the detailed qualitative structure you find in other magical texts like the Picadrix.
So Ficino was maybe simplifying it a bit or focusing differently.
Perhaps. The source suggests some scholars, focusing just on where Ficino borrowed phrases, might have missed the bigger picture, this imposing structure of the spiritual magic of the Renaissance, built on pneuma and fantasy.
Seeing the parts, but not the whole system.
Exactly. And other figures, like Al-Kindi, the Arab philosopher, added important related ideas. He argued that when your imagination strongly conceives of something material, that mental image gains a kind of actual existence within your phantasmic spirit.
The image becomes real in a way, in that subtle spirit.
Yes, and he believed this energized spirit could then emit subtle rays capable of influencing external things, making them conform to the original image.
Wow. So powerful thought doesn't just stay in your head. It can potentially project outwards and shape reality. That's a very direct view of mind over matter.
It is, within this pneumatic framework. Al-Kindi also suggested an image formed in one person's spirit, maybe naturally, due to their birth chart. Their constellatio could resonate and produce the same image in someone else's spirit.
Like mental contagion. Or tuning forks resonating.
Something like that. And Al-Kindi's magic, influenced by Synesius, involved using specific tools, sounds, phonai, substances, hyli, and figures or shapes, schemata. A true wise man who understood cosmic relationships could use these elements to exert specific influences.
Sounds, substances, shapes. The toolkit of the magician grounded in cosmic theory.
And the source details the magic of sounds a bit more. Two kinds: astrological sounds, linked to cosmic harmony, and elementary sounds, linked to earth, air, fire, water. But just making the sound wasn't enough.
What else was needed?
Crucially, the magician needed intense mental application. They had to clearly visualize, represent in their mind, the form or outcome they wanted while making the sound.
Ah, the focused intention again. The mental image empowers the physical action. The phantasm directs the sound.
Exactly. And this connects to a really interesting theory about language itself, originating from celestial harmony. The idea was that the meaning of sounds wasn't just arbitrary convention. Certain sounds were inherently meaningful because of the cosmos,
So the universe itself generated meaningful sounds.
That was the theory. And the power of a sound could be doubled if its inherent cosmic meaning aligned with the meaning humans had given it. This led to ideas about certain languages, like maybe Hebrew being natural languages, closer to the original cosmic sounds and therefore inherently more magically potent.
A language that actually mirrors the essence of things. That's profound. So words themselves could be magic.
Potentially, if used with the right understanding and intent. Magic shapes, characters, symbols were thought to work similarly. And the source briefly mentions the theory of sacrifices found in the Picatrix.
Sacrifices. Animal sacrifices.
Yes. The idea was that the violent death of a specific animal chosen because its nature corresponded to the goal, the microcosm mirroring the macrocosm, created a kind of temporary breach or sympathetic opening in the universal fabric. This allowed the magician's focused will, their phantasm, to enter and exert influence on the macrocosm.
Using ritual death to create an energetic doorway. That's pretty intense.
It really shows the range of practices tied into this worldview, from subtle mental work to complex material rituals. And unfortunately, this world populated by spirits, influences, and powerful phantasms leads us directly into one of the darkest chapters covered here.
Yeah.
The whole complex of demons, witches, and repression.
Yeah, this is where the theory hits the ground with terrifying consequences, isn't it?
Absolutely. The source lays out the belief in demons inhabiting the sublunar zone, our earthly sphere, basically. They were thought of as aerial, aquatic, terrestrial beings, often blamed for calamities, storms, diseases, and for stirring up destructive passions in humans.
So they weren't just abstract evil, but specific entities causing trouble.
Very much so. They were believed to take animal forms, especially dogs. Figures like Pluto were sometimes named as leaders of these evil bands, and people had ways to try and fight them off.
Like what? What could you do against demons?
Various things mentioned are sacrifices of specific stones or plants thought to repel them, wearing amulets or phylacteries with protective inscriptions, using apotropaic statues, figures designed to ward off evil, and even just making loud noises like clanging bronze.
Clanging bronze, like literally banging pots and pans to scare away demons.
Seems like it, yeah. Creating noise, maybe disharmonious sound, to disrupt or repel them. And the Renaissance understanding of all this was heavily influenced by Neoplatonist texts on demonology writers like Porphyry, Iamblichus, Proclus, which Ficino translated. Michael Psellos was another key source, trying to blend these ideas with Christianity.
So ancient philosophy filtered through a Christian lens shaped their view of demons. Was it the same view?
Not quite. There was a crucial difference. The original Neoplatonists usually distinguished between good celestial demons and bad sublunar ones near Earth. But Christian Platonists, like Psellos, tended to view all demons as fundamentally evil. Fallen angels, essentially.
Ah, a major shift. No nuance, just all bad.
Pretty much. They were thought to have these tenuous, dim, pneumatic bodies, unlike the bright, luminous bodies of angels. And Psellos, drawing on someone called Mark of Chersonesus, got incredibly specific about their supposed nature.
How specific?
Uncomfortably specific. He claimed demons could ejaculate semen, could be born inside animals, had limbs, ate spirit and bodily fluids, and even defecated.
Wow, that makes them sound almost biological in a weird pneumatic way. Very unsettling details.
Definitely aimed at making them seem real and tangible, even if subtly so. Psellos divided them into 6 categories based on where they lived: fiery, aerial, terrestrial, aquatic, subterranean, and lucifugus, or dark-loving.
Okay. Were some worse than others?
Yes. The aquatic, subterranean, and dark ones were seen as more dangerous physically, capable of more materialistic action. The others, sublunar, aerial, terrestrial, were thought to work more spiritually by depraving the soul by means of fantasies and cogitations.
Fantasies again. So some demons attack the body or world, others attack the mind through imagination.
Exactly. And the aerial and terrestrial ones were especially believed to provoke erotic fantasies. Because they were pneumatic, they could supposedly take on any form or color they wanted, beautiful, terrifying, seductive, to deceive the human spirit via its fantasy.
Okay, so demons as masters of illusion, generating deceptive phantasms, especially erotic ones. And this is the direct link to the witch craze, right? Demons interacting with people through fantasy.
Absolutely. This is the theoretical underpinning for so many witchcraft accusations. The core charge was often intercourse with demons, incubi and succubi, even animating corpses. Writers like Pierre Naudet and Jean Bodin documented these beliefs. Stories were everywhere. Jordanes de Bergamo told one from Ermelo Barbaro about a guy living with a succubus for 15 years. These weren't obscure ideas, they were common currency.
So deeply held beliefs fueling intense fear, becoming the basis for horrific accusations and persecution.
And the source looks at the practices associated with accused witches, especially the focus on ointment boxes, Pixodaria, and broomsticks, Bacularia. Jordanes de Bergamo wrote that witches said they rode sticks smeared with ointment or rubbed it on their armpits.
The classic image, the flying ointment and the broomstick. Was there anything real behind that, or just fantasy and accusation?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting and disturbing. The source points out that recipes for these alleged witches' ointments often contain powerful drugs, narcotics, hallucinogens, mostly from the nightshade family.
Like what kind of plants?
Things like datura, henbane, hyoscyamus, belladonna, deadly nightshade, aconite wolfsbane, black nightshade, solanum nigrum, even cannabis. Some of these, like datura and black nightshade, were explicitly called magician's weed or devil's weed.
So these weren't just inert salves, they were psychoactive. They could actually induce hallucinations.
Precisely. And the key insight Couliano highlights is that the active compounds in these plants, the alkaloids, are readily absorbed through the skin, transdermally, and the most sensitive areas for absorption, the mucous membranes and thin skin, like the vulva and the armpits.
Which is exactly where they were reportedly applying the ointment or using the sticks. Whoa.
Exactly. So the hypothesis Couliano presents, supported by evidence from figures like Bruno, who described similar folks' practices for pleasure, is that some of these accused sorcerers might have actually been using these potent hallucinogenic ointments
To get high, to have visions.
to seek intense sensory and sexual pleasure through the drug's effects. The result would be incredibly vivid, powerful phantasmic experiences, realistic sensations, images, flights, couplings, which in their drug-induced state and within their cultural belief system, they genuinely believed were real encounters with spirits or actual flights to a Sabbath.
So, the terrifying stories of sex with the devil flying through the night might have been, in some cases, the interpretation of powerful drug-induced hallucinations filtered through the demonology of the time.
That's the hypothesis put forward in the source. It doesn't excuse the persecution, obviously, but it offers a potential material explanation for some of the core experiences reported, beyond just delusion or coercion. It adds a really complex, dark layer.
God, that makes the witch trials even more horrifying. A collision of altered states, cultural fear, and brutal power.
It really underscores how these elaborate belief systems about pneuma and fantasy could intersect with real-world practices and fears to produce devastating outcomes. And this leads us into the bigger picture, the historical turning points, the huge ideological shifts that happened during and after the Renaissance, which ultimately determined the fate of this whole way of thinking.
Right. Why did this worldview, the science based on Eros and magic and phantasms, eventually fade away or get suppressed?
Well, the source challenges the simple narrative first. It quotes the historian Will Eric Pukert saying, the Renaissance wasn't just about rediscovering classical art and literature, it was just as much a rebirth of the occult sciences.
So, magic and astrology weren't just fringe elements, they were central to the Renaissance itself.
That's the argument. And Couliano insists that to really get why modern science eventually rose, you can't just look at economics. You have to understand the tremendous change in human imagination that occurred, the complex ideological battles.
So modern science wasn't just an inevitable, rational progression. It emerged from a clash of worldviews, a shift in how people imagined reality.
That's the perspective here. And the source pushes back against dismissing Renaissance sciences, like astrology or magic, as simply useless. They argue these systems were considered useful and practical within their own context. People got university degrees in them. The idea that they were useless is an after-the-fact judgment from our perspective.
Okay, so we need to understand them on their own terms first. What were the core components of this Renaissance scientific worldview?
Astrology was arguably the most important. Magic, medicine, alchemy were often seen as deeply connected to it, operating under its principles. And alongside all this, you always had Christian doctrine, the church asserting the ultimate authority of revealed truth over natural or temporal truth. It was a complex mix.
A tense mix sometimes, I imagine.
Definitely. And the rise of modern science isn't painted as a smooth ascent. Couliano uses this analogy of natural selection of ideas. Not a planned evolution, but a messy interaction of ideological forces, influenced by chance events, environmental accidents.
Like the example of the wingless fly, surviving only because it was suited to a very specific, harsh environment.
Exactly. Modern science is presented as being like that aberrant product, something that, perhaps against the odds, happened to survive the incredibly harsh ideological selection pressures of the 16th century, a period that basically wiped out the dominant Renaissance sciences.
The 16th century as this intense battleground for ideas, and the source highlights a specific year as pivotal, 1484.
Yes. Astrologers at the time thought 1484 was hugely significant. This goes back to Al-Kindi's theory about great conjunctions, especially Jupiter and Saturn happening every 960 years or so. These were believed to mark major turning points in history, religion, politics, ushering in new eras.
Like cosmic clocks ticking off major world changes.
Sort of, yeah. Roger Bacon had applied this earlier, predicting major prophets or figures every 320 years. Alexander, Jesus, Mani, Muhammad. So for 1484, based on a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in Aquarius, there was this widespread expectation, especially in Italy and Northern Europe, for little prophet to emerge.
The new religious figure, what were they expected to do?
Interpret scripture anew, rally people, bring changes in laws, ceremonies, understanding the divine word. There was debate about where, but Germany, under Scorpio astrologically, was often mentioned. People like Paul of Middelburg and Johannes Lichtenberger wrote explicitly about this messianic expectation linked to 1484.
So people were actively anticipating a major religious shift based on the stars. Did anything else get linked to 1484?
Well, often looking back, people linked the devastating syphilis epidemic, the French disease that swept Europe after 1495 to that 1484 conjunction. Joseph Grunpeck in 1517 gave an astrological explanation. The conjunction caused it because Jupiter, ruling France, is hot and humid. That interpretation stuck around for centuries.
Wow. Everything from prophets to STDs explained by the stars. How does this connect to the witch craze intensification?
The source suggests a direct link. Paul of Middelburg's treatise about the 1384 prophecies likely reached Pope Innocent VIII, alerting him to potential upheaval and perceived dangers. This is thought to have contributed to the timing and urgency of his 1484 papal bull, Summis Desiderantes Effectibus.
The bull that really kicked off harsher witch persecution.
It gave a papal backing, yes, specifically recommending repression in Germany. And it was heavily influenced by the Inquisitor Henry Incitatus, the main author of the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches.
So the astrological prediction potentially fueled the papal decision that greenlit the Malleus and intensified persecution.
It seems to be a key factor in the timing of that bull. However, the source is careful to note that the peak of systematic witch hunting, the really large-scale persecutions and executions, actually came later in the 16th century and was significantly driven by the Reformation. Especially in areas where the Inquisition was less active, lay authorities took over. Historian John Tedeschi confirms the church eventually pulled back from active prosecution.
So the Reformation, while challenging the old church, ironically fueled the witch hunts even more. How did the Reformation impact this whole Renaissance culture of phantasms and occult sciences more broadly?
The source argues it fundamentally abolished it, or at least tried to, by declaring phantasms idolatrous and impious.
Idolatrous? How is an image in your head an idol?
Because so much of Renaissance practice magic, memory arts, even aspects of medicine and astrology relied on deliberately creating and using these internal images. If you declare the images themselves bad, inherently deceptive, idolatrous, then you undermine the entire foundation of those practices. They become forbidden knowledge, dangerous tools.
So rejecting the image meant rejecting the sciences built on it.
Exactly. And the Catholic Counter-Reformation, reacting against Protestantism, also moved in a direction of severity and harshness, abandoning many of the more imaginative, permissive Renaissance stances and becoming more rigid, less image-friendly itself.
So both sides in the religious wars cracked down on this imaginative culture. It must have been a difficult time for people invested in those ideas.
Hugely difficult. The source mentions Agrippa, the famous magus. He had to publicly deny believing in astrology when it suited him, like predicting defeat for the French king to please his rival. It shows how unstable things were.
Walking an ideological tightrope? Did anyone try to adapt these ideas, make them acceptable?
Yes. Bruno, for instance, tried to sort of Christianize or abstract things like astrology and memory art. In his Spazio della Bestia Trionfante, he tried replacing the pagan zodiac signs with virtues and vices, trying to create a Christian sky.
An attempt to merge the old cosmology with Christian values. Did it work?
Well, there's a history of trying to do that, dating back centuries. But the opposition, especially from Puritans, was fierce. English Puritans, influenced by abstract memory systems that rejected images, saw any such images, even Christianized zodiac signs, as idols, just like icons in churches. Bruno had to be very careful with his language around them.
To Puritans, any image linked to these systems was tainted.
Pretty much. And the source uses the heliocentrism debate as another example of this ideological battle. Opponents like Father Mersenne use theological arguments against Copernicus, not just scientific ones. And potential bridges, like Cardinal de Berull's work trying to integrate Copernicanism with theology, were ultimately ignored. The source laments the lack of imagination then and now to bridge these divides.
Resistance wasn't just about the science, it was theology, psychology.
Exactly. Arguments against heliocentrism often cited scripture, yes, but also the psychological comfort of an earth-centered universe. Why disturb people's peace of mind with unsettling new ideas, even if the old system, Ptolemy's, was way more complicated? Practicality and comfort over simplicity and truth, in a way.
Established order versus challenging novelty.
And the source argues that Puritan fear ultimately won out. Fear of estrangement from God led to a hardening of traditional views, a severity that spread even to the Catholic side. But this victory was Pyrrhic. Trying to save the soul from science, from nature, ended up expelling God from the world.
Expelling God from the world, that's a powerful charge. How?
By creating a division. By making nature suspect, by rejecting the idea of reading God's presence in nature, they inadvertently created a framework where nature seemed empty of God, silent. And this leads directly to Pascal.
Pascal, his famous terror of the infinite silent spaces.
Yes, Couliano sees Pascal's anguish as a direct result of this Puritan shift. His terrifying God acts in infinity is the polar opposite of the God-present infinity of earlier thinkers like Cousa or Bruno. His rejection of pantheism, God in everything, is pure Puritanism. It foreshadows Nietzsche.
So Pascal's fear wasn't just about big spaces, but about big empty spaces, spaces vacated by God due to this ideological shift.
That's the interpretation. His anguish stemmed from clinging to an abstract, godless world concept. And this changed the idea of freedom, too. Compare Pico della Mirandola's Renaissance idea of free will connecting man to the cosmos with Kierkegaard's Protestant agony man totally alone, burdened with responsibility after God withdraws. The silence of God becomes the silence of nature.
The universe shifts from being a book of nature full of divine signs to being just silent, dead matter.
Precisely. The Renaissance read that book. The Reformation, in this view, tried to close it, seeing nature itself as the source of alienation from God, not connection. The culprit became sinning nature.
Nature itself is fallen, sinful. And this brings us back to Eros, nature and women, and Faust.
Exactly. It ties together. The source points out the long history of identifying woman with nature and man with culture or religion. This was ancient, medieval, and massively reinforced by texts like the Malleus, which flatly states woman is evil of nature.
Woman as the embodiment of this dangerous, fallen, tempting nature.
The logic went. Nature is mindless, but beautiful, fascinating. It gives life, but also destroys. Religion gives laws to save man's soul. Woman takes nature's role. Man takes religion's. Female beauty, linked to fertility and sex, becomes a prime danger, tempting man away from spiritual purity. Physical signs of fertility, hips, breasts, become signs of sin. The medieval ideal became virtue through denying the body, opposite to natural beauty.
So the female body itself becomes a symbol of temptation and sin.
Yes. And the source contrasts this with the relative permissiveness of the earlier Renaissance fashion, sometimes revealing mixed baths, frank literature, Boccaccio, Rabelais, Bruno, art celebrating the body.
A time when natural beauty and pleasure were maybe less repressed.
But the Counter-Reformation reacted strongly. Look at Spanish fashion. Rigid, concealing, flat chests, binding lead plates, long skirts, high clunky shoes. The church promoted this against dancing and pleasure, even offered indulgences for wearing it. Black became the dominant color.
A very visible rejection of the natural body, aiming for a stiff, almost disembodied look.
And witchcraft imagery then becomes the distorted opposite, which is depicted with exaggerated natural features. Big hips, breasts, buttocks, wild hair. These become signs of being natural, anti-conformist, and destructive. Everything the official culture was trying to suppress.
The witch becomes the projection screen for feared and repressed natural vitality.
Exactly. And the literature and art about witches often became almost pornographic. It was a way to project inhibited desires onto these marginal figures. Accusations detailed sexual perversions, like Hans Baldwin Green's drawing of witches engaged in cunnilingus, or lurid descriptions of the Sabbath.
So the accusations themselves were a way for the society to obsess over the very sexuality it was trying to repress.
That's strongly suggested. And suspicion fell easily. Just being untidy, messy hair, or clothes could make a woman suspect. Anecdotes show intense repression around female bodies, a husband denouncing his disheveled wife, shock at a woman unlacing her corset.
Incredible pressure, and this climate feeds into the Faust legend.
Yes. The German Volksbuch Faust story connects to older traditions. The name Faustus might link to Simon Magus, the Gnostic magician who called himself Fausus and had a consort named Helen, supposedly Helen of Troy, divine wisdom. Faust getting a simulacrum of Helen echoes this, and also the legend of Saint Cyprian of Antioch.
Saint Cyprian, the magician who wanted the Christian woman.
That's the one. He desires the beautiful, chaste Justina. Makes a pact with the devil. Devil can't touch her soul. Gives Cyprian a fake Justina, an illusion, a simulacrum. Cyprian is impressed by her faith, converts, becomes a martyr.
The devil uses illusion, erotic magic, but fails against true faith.
Right. And Calderon's play based on this is key. He shows Faustina, Justina before she's fully Christian, as nature's product, beautiful, erotic, causing desire and trouble, Fausticizes man. She embodies the tension between natural destiny, Faustina, and spiritual aspiration, Justina.
Justina Faustina as the embodiment of that sinning nature that engenders Eros.
Exactly. And Justina's defense isn't fashion, it's internal. Prayer, meditation, focusing on divine phantasms, the devil's attack method, pure erotic magic, following Ficino and Bruno's rules. He targets her fantasy.
He uses the magic system we've been talking about.
Precisely. He evokes gentle erotic phantasms to awaken her dormant nature. He shows her nature itself suffused with Eros birds, plants, flowers provoking love, trying to arouse her carnal side through her imagination.
Using nature's imagery to trigger desire via fantasy.
Yes. But, the source notes, the devil makes a theological mistake. He assumes Justina is only Faustina, only nature. He doesn't grasp that, in Christian theology, like Cardinal Toledo's, free will can't be forced by phantasms alone. But crucially, his method using phantasms to manipulate desire perfectly followed the rules of Renaissance phantasmic magic.
So the magic was right by their standards, but the theology was wrong. Magic versus free will. That's fascinating. It shows these ideas weren't just books. They shaped myths, fears, everything.
Absolutely. They permeated the culture. Which brings us to the legacy. The long shadow cast by these shifts, and Couliano's concluding thoughts.
The consequences of the Reformation killing off this imaginative culture.
The source mentions figures like Glauber, the chemist, whose vision of Germany achieving dominance through chemical weapons foreshadows modern technological warfare born in labs.
A grim link from political ambition to weapons tech.
And Couliano's final verdict in the book, as summarized here, is pretty bleak. He writes that civilization is dying in the trenches dug by the Reformation. He sees the modern West as a fatal result of that shift, echoing Nietzsche.
Wow. That's incredibly pessimistic. A direct line from 16th century ideology to modern problems.
It is a very strong, challenging claim. But he immediately follows it with a question. Is this it? Is this the end result? Or could there be a new Renaissance?
A glimmer of hope. Can we escape this legacy?
He expresses a utopian hope, for one. A rebirth of the world to overcome our modern neuroses, conflicts, divisions.
What would that take? What's needed for a new Renaissance?
In Couliano's view, nothing less than a new Reformation. Not religious, necessarily, but a fundamental change that profoundly modifies human imagination, gives it other paths and other goals, reshapes how we perceive and imagine.
A transformation of our collective fantasy, really.
That seems to be the core of it. But he leaves us with a final unsettling question. If this upheaval, this new Renaissance or Reformation actually happened, would it seem friendly and benign to those living through it?
Probably not. Big changes are usually disruptive, painful, even if ultimately necessary.
It's a sobering thought to end on, the potential cost of transformation.
So wrapping up this deep dive into Chapter 4, wow. We've traced this incredible historical link between Eros and magic, seeing it rooted in the power of fantasy, the pneuma. We saw how that shaped ideas about manipulation, about science like astrology, how it tragically connected to the witch craze, maybe even explained by dread-induced phantasms.
And then that dramatic shift with the Reformation, rejecting the phantasmic imagination, impacting philosophy, religion, fashion, even how people conceived God's presence or absence in the world. It really does offer a powerful, sometimes disturbing lens on how our own ways of thinking were forged in that crucible.
Hopefully this journey has given you listening some valuable insights, maybe some surprising connections about a period often oversimplified. We've seen how they viewed imagination and desire as active forces, tools for connection or control, for good or ill.
Which really makes you think about today, doesn't it? How do you see the power of collective imagination, of fantasy and desire working now, shaping our fears, politics, reality?
Is there a kind of magic in modern influence, advertising, algorithms, political rhetoric? Are they just new ways of manipulating phantasms? Does it all still come down to that chain of chains?
Deep questions. Definitely worth keeping in mind well beyond the Renaissance context.
Absolutely. Always more to uncover when you take a deep dive. Join us next time.